Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast on the Compliance Podcast Network. Today's guest is Yuet Ming Tham, Global Co-Head of Litigation and Investigations at Sidley Austin. Yuet, welcome. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, Mary. Thanks for having me on your podcast. So just by way of background, I studied law in the UK, and I started out as a prosecutor in Singapore many years ago. And when I went into private practice, initially I specialized in litigation and financial regulatory work with Herbert Smith and Clifford Chance in Hong Kong. And then about 15 years ago, I was introduced to the world of FCPA when I joined Pfizer as their first regional compliance director in Asia. So that was my introduction to FCPA and cross-border investigations.
Wonderful. And you're originally from Singapore yourself and speak a few languages?
Yes. I was actually born in Malaysia. But the Singapore passport is a very it's a very useful travel document, and because of the fact that I was born in Malaysia, I can speak Malay and Bahasa Indonesia as well as Mandarin,
and
so
of course
that's been useful.
Wonderful. Yeah. What a fantastic compliment there. What a suite of languages you have. Fantastic. And it comes in so useful in investigations work, which is we've got. Yeah. So that's one of your specialty areas, investigations. And I know that your team does a lot of work across borders. You do work in the Middle East and all sorts of jurisdictions. But today I wanted to particularly pick your brain about investigations within the Asia Pacific region. And while each jurisdiction comes with its own idiosyncrasies and local considerations, both cultural and legal, I'd love to spend some time specifically on China, as it's a fascinating jurisdiction for compliance professionals, particularly when it comes to investigations. However, before we take a look into China, I'd love to hear from you. What are your overarching tips for successfully conducting investigations in Asia Pacific?
So, Mary, I think it's because of the FCPA, right? About 15 years ago, when I started my practice, when I left Pfizer to start went back into private practice. I think at the time, many people hadn't even heard of the FCPA. And now, I have many people who have considerable experience doing investigations in Asia Pacific. But I think one of the things that I still notice is that, it's very easy to forget that Asia is such a vast region. There's so many different cultures, different legal systems, and even within, one country, you could have so many different dialects and languages, such as India. And so, I think it's been a fascinating region for and I've been lucky to be able to start, doing investigations work in a region like this, because there's nothing like being thrown into the deep end. And I think what is interesting about it is how bifurcated the region is. Because there are some people who assume that China is Asia, which is not surprising because for many companies the vast majority of the investigations would be in China, just because problematic or challenging country, but because of the fact that most operations in China would be one of the largest, right, out of any jurisdiction. But yeah, it's bifurcated into civil and common law systems. There are countries that have legal systems that are far more established. You have jurisdictions such as Singapore and Hong Kong and Australia and Japan on one hand, where things are really straightforward. And then you have all the others, where, one of the difficulties is that the law isn't clear. So I think, when you practice in Asia, quite often, the clients don't come to you asking, "Oh, tell me what this law says." What? Give me, like, advise me on the law. I mean, we hardly ever do that nowadays. It's more a case of, this is what the law says, but this is how you do your risk assessment. These are the things that you need to think about. What is your appetite for risk? And so I think, a lot of it has got to do with, just helping the clients in terms of doing the risk reward, calculus, and deciding if, do they want to proceed? How do you want to set up your compliance program, for example? So I think, it's quite interesting because, we work with a lot of, local law firms, and sometimes, and they're fantastic, but sometimes, you do get sort of advice that really just repeats what the statutes say. And, the feedback from clients have been that, they find that useful as a starting point. But what they really need to do is advise on, how do I get through all of that, right? To sort of turn it into something useful in practice for their business. And then the other thing that, I've noticed about, Asia is that, data privacy, data security, employment laws, they're vastly different from, the systems that you will find in the US, for example. So that's another thing that, that would, having, being familiar with employment laws, for example, is actually really important, because quite often, some clients might say, well, if I want to collect data, right, employee data, they automatically say, can you check the data privacy laws for us? But there are times when we'll tell them it's not the data privacy laws that you should be looking at. It's actually the employment laws that will control this. So I think, our steps, for approaching an investigation, I mean, it really is sort of different for different countries. And I often tell the clients that, they're not paying me for that 1 hour, right? Even though we charge, but for the fact that, we've done investigations or, built a compliance program 20 different times for other clients in that particular jurisdiction. Because sometimes the difficulty is you don't know what you don't know.
For sure. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And you mentioned data privacy is something that you keep an eye on at the moment. What are some of the trends that you're seeing in investigations in the Asia Pacific region currently?
I think, Mary, if you had asked me this before COVID, my response would have been quite different, because, I have noticed a change, but this is anecdotal, right? I mean, I haven't done, there haven't been any sort of studies, but, based on the type of work I've seen, I think, because beginning from last year, the feeling is that I think before COVID, we were seeing a lot more local enforcement of, for example, bribery and anti-corruption and, anti-competition provisions. We were seeing a lot more local enforcement by regulators, right, in the different countries. But since COVID has started, it's as though, I think, there just isn't sufficient resources for a lot of countries, right? Because to devote time to that. I mean, you've got courts that are blocked up, and just things aren't getting done because people have been forced to stay at home and lockdowns and all that. So I've seen a vast decrease in local enforcement, except perhaps in China. I mean, China is still very active locally in terms of, local enforcement. So there seems to have been a move from stamping down on corruption to, now there seems to be a focus on the flow of data and cybersecurity. Like I said, this is based on the kind of work that we're getting. And it could be because, people are just not going into the office. So that's why, the cybersecurity world seems to have taken precedence for the moment.
That makes a lot of sense. And certainly cybersecurity attacks increased steeply during the pandemic. So it would be a proportionate response for companies and regulators to, adjust to the changing environment. So we see a lot of business communications in Asia take place within messaging apps rather than our official work emails. And I think that's been the case in Asia for a long time. I know that one of the apps I like to use is WhatsApp. If I'm talking to a friend in China, they'll often ask, do you have WeChat? So those are some of the typical ones. What's your advice for companies to best control data flow, given that we're now in this modern technology world and have forums of communication outside of email? In your experience, is it still worth reviewing company email accounts for investigations in Asia Pacific, for example?
So to answer your last question, it's yes. It's not like 15 years ago, where if you did an email review, there'll be a lot of you find a lot of evidence, very useful evidence. Now not so much, but we do still have situations where you do find very useful evidence from an email review, and sometimes if the matter is sufficiently serious, we actually do recommend or advise the client to take laptops. Because that's where the hard drive is where the important documents are sometimes kept, and not so much in an email system. But going back to business communications, I mean, this is something that our clients are very much alive to, particularly because I think you'll remember the U.S. Department of Justice. They did issue, I think two guidance on business communications, right? And initially, the DOJ took quite a hard stance on this, right? They seem to be suggesting that that the company should prohibit the use of such messaging platforms for business communications. But that was changed because I think there was a realization that you can't do that. It's just not practical. And so I think the Department of Justice then changed that to say that companies should put in place appropriate guidance and controls to ensure the retention of business records. And I mean, that has left some people scratching their heads a little,
right?
Because appropriate guidance and controls, I mean, that doesn't really tell you much. I think the clients that we've worked with, I mean, they have very, very different ways of dealing with this. There are some, very few, who have the budget to issue company cell phones to their employees, because one of the difficulties is that you can say no business communication on WeChats and messaging apps. You can ban that, but it's the enforcement that is the issue. And so I think some clients have issued, personal cell phones or company cell phones to employees and tell them that you have to use this for business communications. But I think, in practice, in the investigations that we have done, we found that sometimes, these phones are not used much at all.
Right. Like, if they have a personal one and they're doing dodgy stuff, why would you not use your personal phone to do the dodgy stuff?
and it's how clean these phones tend to be, or little used, that tell you something, right? But I think the other challenge is that if you're communicating with a customer, they don't necessarily have the ability to send you an email as easily as as compared to if they were to use WeChat or WhatsApp or Kakao, or Line. Right, because if you write to a customer, sometimes not every company would have like a fantastic, well-built IT system, right? There are some clients, some customers, local customers who have a system that isn't as sophisticated, and so they just find it easier to use messaging apps to do that. And so if the customer writes to a sales rep, for example, through WhatsApp, it's in practice, it is very difficult for the employee to say, no, you have to write to my email, my company email. So I think, a lot of companies realize that. And so I think, we've seen some companies will say things like, if it's a substantive business communication, you should you should use, the company system. Or official, IT systems. But I think there is a realization amongst all these policies that you can't really force people to never use these messaging apps. So sometimes, we do, a lot of clients still do impose that policy though. In practice, they still have that policy where they'll say, you have to, you cannot have, work emails or official communication on anything other than the email system. Or sometimes, clients would set up their own enterprise WeChat system where they say that you have to use, this application for communications. Again, the reality is, how often are you able to enforce this? I mean, unless there is a whistleblower or a reporter who's willing to share the information, right? Who shares screenshots of WeChat communication with you, it's very difficult to find out.
I agree. And I can see why companies are still persisting with the line of you need to put substantive things in email, avoid using the messaging apps, including, the text messaging on iPhones, for example, because what else are you left with, right? You raise a very good point that enforcement is going to be difficult, but if you don't at least try and put down some controls, then you're not taking adequate steps to try and prevent wrongdoing from occurring on your watch, or I guess the whole point is not on your watch. And the other thing is if you do find out that they have been using illicit communications, then at least you can point to being able to something that would call for punishment if necessary, even if you're not finding the exact bribery breach or whatever it is that you're pretty sure you suspect is happening. You can still have a deterrent by putting in place punishment if someone gets caught for disobeying the rules.
Absolutely.
So, Yuet, I wanted to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty with you about some of the specific China circumstances that are really of interest to the average practitioner who needs to deal with investigations in China, as these types of things can come up and, potentially cause problems, or at least there's a perception that it's going to be a problem to being able to sufficiently conduct your investigation. So the first one I have for you is, how does the China state secrets law impact a company's ability to conduct investigations pertaining to their China entity?
I mean, the state secrets law has been around for a while. And, you probably remember at one time, there was a lot of press and media reports about it and how, draconian it is. I think, the challenge for a lot of companies was that the way it was drafted was rather broad. But I think, there is a common misconception that, it is so broad that, everything is a state secret. I mean, I've heard, things like that, or comments like that, or that, they can, it's so broadly drafted that, they can decide, the authorities can decide what is state secrets, after the fact. I don't, I think, to be fair, I don't think the provisions are that broadly drafted. And, if you look at the provisions, I mean, I'm not going to go into details here, but, they talk about, any information that involves national security or, the military or in sensitive industries. That's where you need to be a little bit more careful, such as resources and infrastructure. But I think, if you look at the provisions, they do make it clear that, it only applies to information that has been, that has been categorized by certain agencies as state secrets. So it's not one of those where, even trade information is going to be considered trade secrets. And to be honest, I mean, in practice, we don't actually come across this problem all that often.
Right.
So so I think it's one of those things where a little information is the dangerous thing. I've had suggestions made, such as, well, this could be state secret, so perhaps, you should send someone into China because we can't send it out of China. We should have someone go into China to review the information. And I think my response was that, if it is state secrets in the first place, you are not supposed to be sharing it with anyone, full stop. So I don't think it really helps to send someone into China to review. And so I think, in practice, it hasn't really been a major issue. But what is different would be, the whole slew of the laws that have been issued in the past few years. I think that is going to impact investigations quite a lot, unlike the state secrets provisions.
So the state secrets may have been something that at first blush people get worried about, but a lot of the time if you read what's there, the chances of it affecting the particular information that you're investigating is probably not that likely, although obviously what I'm saying is not legal advice, dear listener. Just looking purely at statistics here, the likelihood. And there are some new things coming in that would proportionately worry you more. Can you share a little bit of information about some of the things that we should be looking out for that could be problematic?
So I've heard, people call these the blocking statutes. It's basically, a slew of laws that have come out over the past few years. There are so many of them that we've now done a sort of a white paper for our clients, just to summarize what the provisions are. And because, they all overlap so much that there is some confusion, I think, in terms of how they work in practice. So we've actually done, white papers, summaries, really short ones. I mean, not like a repeat of all the legal provisions, basically, because that's not going to be of any use to anyone. So that the clients can think about, how do I change, for example, our investigations protocol? Do we need to change, how data flows in and out of China, for example? How do you retain data? So those are the more practical things that, I think the clients find more helpful rather than, what is the definition of, of this and that. So I think one of the first provisions that came out was the International Criminal Judicial Assistance Law, the ICJAL. It's quite a mouthful. But I think what is interesting is that this applies only to criminal matters. And basically, it says that where an entity or an individual outside of China requires evidence from China-based entities or China-based persons for the purposes of criminal proceedings outside of China, you will need to seek, make a request from a Chinese authority to get that evidence or that information. So first of all, this only applies to criminal proceedings. I think the best way of thinking about this would be that it's similar to a mutual legal assistance treaty. An MLAT, where if you want evidence, relating to a Chinese entity or person, then you have to go through a Chinese authority for that information. So it's not that different, right, from an MLAT, where if the US DOJ wants information relating to a Singapore bank account or a Singapore entity, they would have to go through the Attorney General's chambers in Singapore. Because I used to deal with those, when I was, during my days as a prosecutor. So again, nothing unusual about that. But, if you have a DOJ investigation, that's where you have to think very carefully about, how do you produce information to the DOJ if the information comes from China. Another one is the cybersecurity law. So this came into effect in June 2017, I think. And it basically requires, critical information infrastructure operators. Again, a mouthful, to have in place, all personal information and important data within China. So this is like a data localization requirement. And it applies to operators of certain industries, important industries, which they've classified as, public communications, i.e., telecoms companies, energy companies, water conservation, public services. So if you operate, information in the context of these industries or these companies, then that data needs to be kept in China, unless you do a security assessment as to whether, would it be against the interests of national security if you were to transfer that data outside of China. To be honest, this isn't that unusual. There are many countries who have similar provisions. Singapore has one.
And it's a high threshold to meet being something of interest to national security.
Yes,
not everything's
it
going to
is.
be, not everything's going to trigger that.
No, but I think, again, and, rightly so, I suppose. I think some people, I think the concern is that, what is national security, right? Because if you don't know state secrets, you might not know what national security
That's right.
means.
I just realized in my mind, like, it's so clear to me because when I worked at the Data Privacy Authority in New Zealand, that is one of the defenses for withholding a data information request is if providing that information would compromise national security. And so, and because of my work there, I learned actually very few circumstances come into play, and they're really quite specific. So in my mind, I'm like, oh yeah, this is fine. But I guess not everyone has been in the position where you're actually thinking very consciously about national security, and then maybe even less people are thinking about, okay, well then how do you define a state secret? What falls under that? So that's a great point.
Exactly. But I think, sometimes for the clients, again, this isn't something that comes up that often because, it's not often that you come across, that you be doing work for, these critical information infrastructure operators. So it doesn't really come up that much, I think, in terms of out of all the work that we do. And another one is the data security law. So that one is really fresh because it's going to be, it's effective September 1st, 2021. And so, this one basically says cross-border data transfers, if there is any important data, again, a security assessment needs to be performed before it can be transferred outside of China. And the definition of important data, unfortunately, has not been defined.
Yikes. And that one, I feel like that is going to be a much easier threshold to satisfy than state secrets or national security.
That's true. I think, but what is interesting, I mean, from the perspective of investigations is that, this data security law also says that you cannot provide important data in China to a foreign judicial or law enforcement organ unless a Chinese competent agency has approved this.
My goodness, think about the bureaucracy involved there, my lord.
So, and this is not just limited to criminal proceedings.
Oh dear, it's broader.
So this is one that, we are watching very closely because, the government hasn't released all the, the important definitions and the guidance. So I think that's the one that we're looking out for very, very closely.
Wow.
But I mean, I think in general, we do advise the clients to be careful by, perhaps, if you don't have to, if the review can be done in China, then do it there, right? Don't send information outside of China unless unnecessarily. I mean, try to keep it within the borders. That would make things easier.
Yep.
And the thing is, I mean, data localization is not a new concept because we do a lot of data privacy work, data security work, and there have always been countries, right, that have data localization requirements for certain industries. Indonesia, for example, has got localization requirements for data relating to the financial industry. So again, this isn't that unusual, but I think given how important China is, as a jurisdiction as a market for many of our clients, I mean, this is something that I think everybody is trying to figure out what this means in practice, and so I think we are learning as we go along. Just in terms of how does this translate? Do you set up your own server in China? Right, we're seeing a move towards doing that. And just things like do you want to use an investigations team outside of China?
Right. Why would you unnecessarily do that if you already have a competent team within the borders?
Exactly. And I think the last one is the personal information protection law. So I mean, this one basically, it's China's overarching personal data protection legislation, because before that, it was everywhere.
It was a
data
hodgepodge.
privacy was just challenging. And so this one takes effect, I think it's November 2021.
Yeah, it's November. Yep.
Yep.
I think I just saw something on that today that it will be November.
So it's quite similar to the GDPR. I think, just to, I'm oversimplifying it, but it's vastly. But I mean, I don't think that's inaccurate.
No, it's like the statement, this thing tastes like chicken. We can just, this data privacy law is a bit like the GDPR. Yeah, I feel like that's fair to say.
But it is quite similar. And because what is interesting about the GDPR is that in countries such as Singapore, passing laws that are very similar, because they want to try and meet the adequacy provisions, in the GDPR for recognition, right? So I think it's still really helpful to have this because, to have this new law, because, instead of a hodgepodge of, different legislation.
Yeah, that was not easy.
Yeah, exactly. But again, I mean, what is interesting about this one from investigations point is that, it prohibits the transfer of personal information to foreign enforcement authorities unless you get approval from a Chinese agency. So that, again, is something that, we are watching really closely to see what that means.
Well, similarly, I think I wanted to ask you about the blocking statute, but just before I do, you mentioned that you've got like a raft of white papers on some of these topics that you've just been talking about. And I know your clients' briefings and alerts are really nicely written, like they're really written with someone in mind who doesn't necessarily have a lot of time. They're straight to the point. They're straight to what do you need to know as an in-house practitioner. Would it be okay if I collected some of those from you afterwards and popped them with your episode in our LinkedIn group for Great Women in Compliance to share as a reference, a resource, sorry.
Absolutely.
Super.
We'd be happy to, yeah. It's not legal advice, of course.
Oh, obviously not. And just to be clear, everyone, literally 0 episodes of Great Women in Compliance have been official legal advice. Please consult with your own lawyer before applying anything that we've discussed. So it's the China blocking statute. Will you give us the purpose of this law and how companies should address it?
I think, that's still under discussion. And, I think it'll be a bit difficult to go into detail on that.
Any general comment? Watch this space kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's more a watch this space. That would be, it's more that category.
Yeah, okay. So maybe do some preliminary reading on it, see what's out there for now, and look out for upcoming developments.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Well, I made you sweat with a little bit of substantive questioning there, and we really appreciate that. But of course, Great Women in Compliance is not just about what we do for our day jobs. It's about so much more about ourselves as professionals generally, women who have lives outside of compliance as well. And so I like to make sure that we fit in something that's not purely substantive. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about, you referred to earlier that you were at Pfizer. So before you were in private practice, you were an in-house compliance practitioner. What do you miss the most about being a compliance officer?
I think, I miss being part of business review meetings. I mean, some people might say I'm crazy to say that, but I think the difference between, in-house and being in private practice is that, when you're in-house, you have one client, really. And when you do compliance, you are asked to attend you do more of the business side of things. I found that very interesting, even sometimes, budget meetings and things like that. I know some people think I'm crazy to miss that part, but at the same time, though, I mean, the advantage about being in private practice is that I have so many different clients, so many different industries that I could be doing work for, and so I have really fond memories of my time with Pfizer. It was a long time ago, but I it's one of those things where you go to different countries and you're part of you feel much closer to the management, for example, much more on the business side of things. Whereas when you do compliance and investigations work, obviously it's not the same. Even though you do need to understand the business side of things very well, it's not the same.
Yeah, and one of the things that I like about being on the in-house side is you get the follow-up as well, right? So if I do an investigation with you as external counsel, it comes to an end when the investigation would end. But for me in-house as the practitioner, I see more. I see the remediation go into effect. I see potential disciplinary action taken, the effect that any issues might have on the business moving forward. So you get that kind of holistic picture. But what I miss a lot about being in consultancy and private practice that is related to your, having so many different clients doing so many different things at once that, you're really kept on your toes with interesting cases and things happening simultaneously. But I miss that benchmarking and oversight as well, right? So you're able to say, what we're seeing with our clients is this, whereas I'm like, yikes, I need to call a friend if I want benchmarking information, or I need to find a benchmarking survey with something that's recent. And I miss having that knowledge like right at my fingertips, like being able to say right off the bat and with confidence, yeah, other people are doing this. I'm seeing this as an example to combat this, like that part. And so I really wanted to end on that note, Yuet, so that, you would feel your grass is greener. Even though I asked you what you missed, like the being on your side of the fence is super cool as well.
No, Mary. I mean, I totally, I'm just, like I said, I've got really good memories of, my time at Pfizer. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode, and I'm so grateful to you, Yuet, for your time. You're a practitioner that I really admire. You're not only substantively strong, but you're just a really fun person to chat with, and I'm really glad to know you.
Oh, thank you, Mary.
Well, to wrap up this episode today, everyone, we have our advertising essentially for an upcoming joint episode. Lisa and I are about to enjoy our seasonal 2-week break, but we have some homework for you if you wouldn't mind. We would love to ask you to send us for our Halloween episode, which will bring us back from our vacation time. What is your compliance horror story for Halloween? So our special Halloween episode will be sharing the stories that you submit. It can be about everyday stuff as a compliance officer, anything you've encountered doing your regular work. It could be about the job hunting process. It could be about a business trip gone awry. I'm expecting this one to be funny and full of life. So don't hold back on us. And if you want to be anonymous because your story is a little bit horrifying and you don't want to be associated with it, but you think it's good for us to share, then 100% we will not name you. Send your submissions through to Lisa and myself. You can choose to send to us directly, or don't forget our Gmail account, gwicpod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to hearing from you and your horror stories so that we can all laugh about them together very shortly. Take care.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.